Hello everyone, this is Reza. Welcome to another video of FX series in Maya. In this video, we're going to explore how to create a very easy to follow and very simple disintegration effect. Now, this process and this technique can be very complex if you were to add fluid simulation and secondary particle layers on the top, but that's not really the scope of this video. I'm just going to show you how to create a very simple effect using out-of-the-shelf tools in Maya. Once you understand the workflow, then all these fancy secondary layers can be added to jazz up the look of the final product. Now let's have a look at what we have in the scene. It's a simple model with a very simple spotlight. I've got about 200 frames, and also playback is set to play every frame. That's what we need for this particular example. Now the topology on this model is rather clean, and interestingly enough, for this integration effect, for this effect, we need a messy topology. I know it sounds weird, but we are going to actually sabotage the topology and create some sort of irregularities, because those irregularities help us to produce a more realistic and natural look. So let's get into it. First things first, I'm going to triangulate this very nice topology that I have. So with the model selected, I'm going to go to Mesh and Triangulate. Now every quad turns to a triangle. Also, Shift right click and go to Smooth option box. And I'm going to use exponentially smooth level to 2 to add to my resolution. Now you can see I'm dealing a very dense resolution now, but that's okay, because that's exactly what I need. Now from this point, there are two ways of creating the effect. One is to use a multi-cut tool, and that's a very popular way of working, where you actually hold down Shift and drag to have a cut, and you continue doing that for the entire mesh. But I have another way, which is my preferred way, because you can actually direct the way that you implement the cut, and it's a more of a kind of artistic approach, if I may. To do that, I'll go into Edge, and then I select Paint Selection Tool. You can always hold down B and fix the radius of your brush. Let's say that's the brush that we want. And you can go and start painting the areas that you want to have your cut. Now the idea is to cut the geometry into smaller pieces, and then we use nCloth system and with the help of force fields to create that disintegration effect. Now this allows us to use gravity, volume axis, turbulence to randomize the effect, and it allows us to customize or direct the type of flow that we are looking for. Now I'm gonna spend a little bit of time and create as many pieces as possible, and I try to be a little bit random about it, and then we get to the next step. Now it is really up to you guys how small or big those pieces you want them to be. And the beauty of this method is you can actually have full control over that, but let's say that's what we want, right? So the idea is not to follow a specific look, but rather to explain the workflow. Now once that's done, you can go ahead and open them up using detach. Best on your computer. This process might take a while, but mine took about 10 seconds. So just to verify that you have actually created open geometry, go to display, polygon, and I'm going to tear off the menu, and we have border edges. Now if I zoom in, you can see that I can kind of see all the border edges. So it is kind of clear. I can go and turn off border edges or leave them on. It's really up to you. But let's call this one done. Let's say that's what we want. And let's move on to the actual effect. So the scene preparation part is done. Also, I think it's a good idea to always have a backup of this geometry, so simply duplicate it before you tessellate it. So in case if you want to have or try a different pattern, then you can always go back and redo the steps if need be. Now the next step is to actually turn this object into an nCloth. So for that, you need to go to FX, nCloth, create nCloth. If you don't have any nucleus node in your scene, then Maya recommends to create a new one, which we are going to say yes. Then probably it's a good idea to rename them. So nucleus underscore disintegration nCloth underscore disintegration. Now, if I look at my nCloth shape node, you can see you have many values in here to change, and also you can make use of this preset and get the closest result that you want. For example, if you create silk, then there is no rigidity on those pieces, whereas if you select something like concrete, they're going to turn to very rigid objects. So the look of it is going to be completely up to you. I'm not going to spend any time on this because, well, the idea is to show you the workflow rather. So we're going to skip that. I'm going to go straight to the nucleus node and talk about some of these attributes. So I would like to use plane, but if you have a different surface, then you need to make sure to select the surface and then go to nCloth and turn it to a passive collider. But if it's a flat surface, this ground plane works beautifully, and to be honest with you, you save some memory and speed because of this option. So this is always preferred. I would like to add a little bit of friction, so probably 0.8, and maybe I'm going to use more sub-steps with more iteration on it. Now it's time to use our forces. Before I do that, another tip I would like to give you is if I select the model and look at it from an orthographic view, I'm going to change the background for now, and I'm going to enable the grid. Very important, make sure that the object is not in or collide with the grid. So I'm just going to lift it up just a tad, just to make sure that there's a little bit of gap in there. If the object is exactly on top or inside the grid, because of the default gravity and the ground plane, it collapses before we even start simulating. Now let's go back to perspective and create one. So I'm going to select the model, go to Field and Solver, and create a volume axis. Just going to go to the option box, call this volume axis underscore disintegration. Magnitude of 5 works for us just fine. Volume shape, we need to make sure that cylinder is set up. We don't want this to force from the center of the volume, but rather around the volume. So I believe the default for away from axis is 1, set it to 0, and around axis set to 0, make sure there's a value in there. We start from 5, but we may actually, I am going to actually start from 10 here, and we'll take it from there. If we need to have more, then we are going to increase more. Now, for turbulence, we would like to have a little bit of turbulence in here. I'm going to start with 0.5. Speed of 0.2 works just fine. And we would like to have more frequency to get more interesting patterns. So 3, 3, and 3. I think that should work for us. And I'm going to just press Create. Now, the default size is pretty small, so I'm going to make sure that I've got a decent size in here. So I'm just going to move this up. Maybe if I go to here, I can actually scale this down to something like 2. Don't want to make it too thin. Maybe scale Z to 13 and scale X to 13. So I have something with proportion. Now this arrow is a round axis that we specified. And of course you can always change this here. So if I set this one to 0, we can see this is gone, and we can always have away from axis, but we don't want that. We want a round axis, just in case if you would like to have a slightly different effect, you can always have that. Now, this is going to push the nCloth away and create that disintegration, which is the whole purpose. But to do that, I need to keyframe it, because by default, it just stays on the top and pushes everything to the ground, whereas I would like this to go in and through the model, and that creates a much more interesting effect, considering that kind of tornado-like effect that I have going on inside the volume. So I'm going to make sure that I'm in frame 1, and let's bring it up to something like 20, and I think I get a much more interesting result if I give it a bit of a slant, maybe 25 degrees. Yeah, that's more like it. I'm gonna make sure that these two channels are keyed, and you can always enable auto key so you don't need to set key every single time. For now, let's go to frame 50, and probably I'm going to move this one down to something like -5, and I'm probably going to bring this to 0. So that's the type of effect that I'm getting. That's good. Now let's go to frame 50, and in frame 50 we can actually keyframe this attribute right here, magnitude, and in frame 51 I can turn this to 0, simply because I really don't want magnitude to affect the scene after we disintegrate the object. The rest can be done through external force field that we are going to add and apply. For now, let's go to the camera 1. Just going to quickly turn the background to black. And then one last tweak before I play blast is I'm going to go to gravity and turn off the gravity. Again, I would like to have full control over the movement, and gravity pulls everything down before we even start. So it's kind of unnecessary at this point having any gravity, and at any point of time you can add one or tweak the one that comes with nucleus. All right, let's go and do a quick play blast, and we will be back shortly after the play blast is done. Okay, let's have a look at the result. We can see the disintegration takes place, but you can actually now go ahead and direct some of these pieces. Now it is up to the project brief and how you want this disintegration to take place, but for the sake of demonstration, I'm just going to add a few fields here and there just to show you how to start. Now, first things first, I think I now need a little bit of gravity in here. So probably gravity of 0.2 is a good starting point. I'm going to go to the very first frame, and the first node or the first field I would like to add would be uniform. So uniform is good when you would like to push objects basically in a uniform direction. So I do use this a lot actually. Magnitude of 5 is way too much, especially for this scene. Considering the scene size, it just pushes everything to one direction in 1 second is not something that I want. So probably 1.5 would be a good value, and I randomize these directions so it doesn't just go into one direction. Maybe 0.6 in X, 0.3 in Y, and 4 in Z. And I'm gonna call this uniform disintegration. I also would like to have just a little bit of turbulence. You can add a turbulence on the nucleus node and the volume axis node that you have, but having an external nucleus node enables you to just have a really cleaner workflow. So I'm just going to call this turbulence disintegration, magnitude of 0.75, and I'm going to lower the frequency a little bit, and that should really do it. I'm going to go create. So that's basically how you add passive colliders or add fields and solvers to just direct the result. Now let's do a quick play blast again and see what changes are made to the result, and we'll be back in a second. Now here's the result. You can see those pieces starts moving to the right hand side after good 100 frames, and that's where we have the uniform field to start having an impact, and then the little tiny value of turbulence we can see is doing its part, and then from this point onward it's all a matter of selecting this guy, make all the changes that you want. So for example, I can go to uniform and say, well, I want just a little bit more push. You can select the nucleus and say, well, I want more gravity, and that gravity I want not only in -y, but also probably -x, but I'm not going to put -1, I'm just going to go -0.4. Then you may go to your turbulence and say frequency, I just want to even lower that just a tad, and no attenuation, right? And these are all the creative decisions that you make based on the brief or the instructions that you get from another department or another team that you're working with. So once that's done, then the easy part, you select the model, make sure you're in FX menu set, and you go to cache, create a new cache, and then because it's a nucleus node, we use an object. So I'm just going to call this disintegration shape, and everything is set. Make sure to save the file, and then you hit create. Once that part is done, you're actually baking the animation and everything is ready for rendering. So I am going to create the cache, and after that I'm going to go to render settings. I'm using Arnold. I can go to create an animation for the entire 200 frames. I don't want to use perspective, just the camera, and I would like to render it 720p. Feel free to even add a motion blur to it. It makes it even more interesting. You add to your render time, but motion blur is always nice. And of course, you can increase the camera sample. I use subsurface scattering, so I can even increase that. And after that, you make sure you're in rendering, and you either batch render or render sequence with the correct camera. Now I'm going to go ahead and create cache for 200 frames. We'll render the scene and see you one last time to review the final result. And here's the result. I truly hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I'll leave all the artistic decisions to you. Feel free to go back, change a few settings. I have a proper introduction to nCloth video on YouTube, so if you would like to make further changes to these cloth pieces, then by all means go ahead and watch that video as well. Other than that, that's few basic steps on how to create this effect, and you can easily take it to the next level since you're in a good position to start with. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and see you in the next one.